my name is Derek. I want to welcome you to Random Philosophy. Today I want to talk to you about Gabriel Marcel. He was an existentialist philosopher, and I'm going to be talking specifically about a book by Seymour Cain, just with the title Gabriel Marcel. Gabriel Marcel lived from 1889 to 1973, and he was a contemporary of Sartre. And I think it's unfortunate that when most people think about influential existentialist philosophers, they think of Sartre. And Gabriel Marcel was arguably more influential than Sartre was. And the two knew each other. They engaged with each other. They met together on a regular basis, and they each mentioned the other in their works. Gabriel Marcel actually coined the term existentialism, and because of the way that Sartre used the term, because of the fact that Sartre appropriated the term and used it to describe his own philosophy, Gabriel Marcel decided he didn't want to use it anymore, and he began calling himself a neo-Socratic, or just called his philosophy the philosophy of existence. And when you look at the history of philosophy, it's always being broken down into schools of thought, and one of the major divisions is between the analytic and the continental traditions. And there's been a lot written. It's kind of a complicated subject, so to make it overly simple, just for the purposes of my talk, I'm going to describe analytic philosophy as more interested in problem solving, where continental philosophy is in the humanistic tradition, and it's more along the lines of literature, art. It's exploring the human condition versus solving problems. And another distinction that Gabriel Marcel made was he said that he thought Descartes was wrong. When Descartes wrote his Meditations, he came to the conclusion that we are thinking beings first, and Gabriel Marcel said that he kind of he missed the boat there. He wasn't looking at it correctly. And that what he should have seen was that we experience the world first. We don't think and analyze the world first. We are first beings who experience the world, where we find ourselves to be beings in a situation. I mentioned that Gabriel Marcel was an existentialist. He was also a phenomenologist. And a phenomenologist is someone who studies consciousness from a first-person perspective. He was also a religious thinker, a nonconformist religious thinker. And other similar thinkers were Martin Buber, and Nicholas Bergedov. And he was a nonconformist. Gabriel Marcel was a Catholic nonconformist thinker. He was actually anti-Thomas in some of his writings. But he was religious, so he was proclaiming a human community centered in God. Some of the thinkers who influenced Gabriel Marcel were Henry Bergson, the German and English idealists, and just the Americans Josiah Rice and William E. Hawking. So it's difficult to sum up Gabriel Marcel's thinking because he never pursued a chair, and he didn't create a system of philosophy, and he was not a systematic thinker, and he's more like an artist or a writer who says what he says or creates what he creates in response to an inner demand. So later in life he did create what could be called the concrete philosophy, but in his early writing, his metaphysical journey, or his metaphysical journal, it could be seen more as, could be similar to what a scientist does when he was recording empirical evidence. Only what Marcel was recording was a process of inquiry into consciousness. And what Marcel was doing was saying what he thought philosophy was really like. And he was doing this through his writings that are more like a diary or a phenomenological essay. And you're not going to find arguments, but rather insight. and similar to the appreciation of art and history and religion and what it means to engage with other people. Another way that Marcel engaged was through music. He was an auditory person. He thought there were voices that we listened to. He improvised music. He created music, and he saw it as something of a dialogue. And then the third way that he communicated his ideas of what philosophy was through dramatic writing. He wrote a lot of plays. Started writing plays in 1914, and he hoped to influence the common man through his plays. He hoped to become well known and influential through his plays, and he was rather surprised that his other serious writings gained him more. He was just surprised that people were more interested in his philosophical writings than they were his plays. And his style of play was a tragedy, and he thought that we even learned metaphysics from the drama of human existence shown in his plays. Alright, well, I mentioned that Marcel was influenced by idealists and idealism, and he saw himself as being in a struggle against idealism, as did other philosophers like Sartre and Kierkegaard. And at first idealism was attractive to him, but he found that he couldn't accept, or he refused to accept that he was only a mind, and refused to deny that he existed as a body. And he refused to deny his experiences. And he believed that there was a real world with real beings outside his mind, with which he had relations. Because idealism, after all, is the idea that everything is mind or thought, and that there is a difference between my mind and my body. And the idea is that thoughts cannot be doubted. Well, Marcel came to the conclusion that it's rather sensation that can't be doubted, and existence can't be doubted. So, even though he was raised in a non-religious home, Marcel also was on a religious search for the reality that is there underneath those sensations. And he saw faith as very important. And because he was raised in a non-religious home, he didn't have strong feelings one way or the other about religious faith. So he was able to deal with that topic in an even-handed way. And Marcel's first plays, written in 1914, Grace and the Sandcastle, deal with some of these religious themes. And there's even a character in the play Grace who is envious of others who had a religious faith. And this character is very much like Marcel, in that he was also raised in a skeptical environment and given a skeptical education. And the play ends with this character proclaiming the reality of faith. And to give you a timeline, after these plays, written in 1914, Marcel started working on his metaphysical journal, the first half of it. And then when World War I started, Marcel didn't have very good health, so he didn't fight, but he rather was given a position with the Red Cross, and he worked to help families find their missing family members. And this made an impression on him. This is how real can you get? Here's real people searching for their real loved ones. And then Marcel started on, in the second half of his metaphysical journal, he started detailing his metaphysical experiments. And one of these experiments was automatic writing. And he continued to be interested in these metaphysical experiments and recording what happened all through his life. And one of the ways he broke with idealism was just, he worked on the idea of participation. He saw that participation was a communion between real beings. And it contains the concept that this global concept that we all have, that we are, and that we feel that we exist. And And the idea that Descartes had was that I think, therefore I am, and that's Marcel saw it as very isolating. It's just tends to make one just concentrate on only himself and his thoughts. Because idealism is, after all, the idea that all is mind or thought, and that thought cannot be doubted. And Marcel came to the conclusion that it's actually sensation that can't be doubted, and that existence cannot be doubted. Marcel came to the conclusion that we have sensations through our body first, so he saw that as defeating the error of idealism, this idea that the mind and body were separate. And Marcel saw participation as central to ideas like prayer and faith and the love between man and woman. So idealism, that leads to a dualism, that there's a difference between the body and mind. And the conclusion was that the thought and mind can't be doubted. And that is what Marcel saw as the supreme error of idealism, this disassociating of mind and body. And our thoughts, Marcel was of the opinion that our thoughts distort our sensation, not the other way around. And getting back to participation, Marcel saw this feeling and sensation is not receiving something. Your body isn't an instrument, but it's rather when we feel something, we participate in an immediate, there's an immediacy about it. So my body is not a thing I possess, it's me. And when I say something exists, I'm saying this other thing that exists, it's as real as I am. When I say other people exist, I say they are as real as I am. And it exists, it's existence that can't be doubted. And as part of this, we acknowledge that existence has worth. And we affirm our existence through this immediate feeling that we have, this immediate knowledge and participation in feeling. And we recognize existence through thought. So existence already exists, and we just recognize it through our thoughts. For Marcel, the body is not an instrument. It's not something I own. It's something I am. And he saw himself as a body and self, a body/self in a world of other body/selves. So not a world of ideas, but a world of other beings like himself. So in this way, there's no danger of alienation. There's no danger of alienation if we see ourselves as other body/selves in contact with other beings. And if we do reduce everything to ideas, then there is that alienation. And then Marcel, he does admit that systematic knowledge and objective analysis can have a useful scientific purpose. But on its own, it's inadequate. If we were just to use systematic knowledge and objective analysis, then we're not really grasping the full reality of the fact that we are selves in relation to the world. So in Marcel's metaphysical journal, participation is the main theme, and some authors have translated that as availability. And it's all about I-thou relationships. So Marcel's thinking is that we can relate to objects as thous, or we can relate to people as its. And of course the optimum is to see people as other beings like ourselves, so I-thou relationships. And that thou, that is because he was influenced by Martin Buber. And so in other languages, in French, Marcel's native language, there's another word that they use that indicates a closeness, an informal way of talking to people because you're close to them. And that is what
That's what the translator is reaching for when he translates that as thou. And so when we see each other as, when we participate in these I-thou relationships, we're seeing realities on both sides, and the reality is that there's a being on the other side. And then the love associated with this is not because of any good qualities or because of virtues that the object of your love has, but just because, you're just affirming them as an object, as a being that you love. And the other is a partner in this relationship, not an object. And as far as religion and God, Marcel saw God as the absolute thou. And in Marcel's way of thinking, we can't see God as an object. He can only be seen as an intimate partner. And he's the absolute intimate partner. He can never be judged as a he or an it. And there's an unverifiability in this relationship. And then going along with that religious theme, Marcel saw prayer as a being with. And prayer in Marcel's way of thinking was something that can transform your being, but it doesn't really add. You can't pray for things. You can only pray to be a better person. You can pray to be more, but not to have more. And again, there's that feeling, or there's that idea of unverifiability. So Marcel believed that God was there and He's listening to our prayers. He created us in a creative act, and He responds to our prayers, but that's not really something but it's still nothing that can be verified. And these I-thou relationship with God there are trials involved. And there's going to be suffering and frustration and contradictions. And the religious man is someone who concentrates on the present moment. And these trials can be overwhelming, but they can also lead to our salvation. And there's always, in trials in our lives, there's always the temptation to give up and to give into nihilism and meaninglessness. But this can also result in our becoming a unified being again, that can serve us and save us and lead to reunification. And then, so in trials, our very soul and being are at stake. And then life itself can be seen as a long trial. It's interesting to note that all of these ideas were, all this religious doctrine was created by Marcel before he was an adherent to any historical known world religions. It's just something that he came up with on his own as someone who grew up in an agnostic home. And he was just a secular, uncommitted philosopher, and he was just looking at human experiences, and these are the ideas that he came up with. From the time period of 1923 to 1928, Marcel did no philosophical writing, and during that time period, he was doing doing critical analysis of literature and plays and music. And then in 1929, he converted to Catholicism. And then in 1933, he included an article in a book of his plays titled Concrete Approaches to the Ontological Mystery. And this was basically the summation of the themes in his 1935 book, Being and Having. And he saw this as the hingepin of his work. And the topics covered in this were problem versus mystery, among the things covered in this is just the whole idea of problem versus mystery. And Marcel had kind of a rough time right after he converted to Catholicism. It wasn't like he was in despair and then things got better. Even after he converted, I mean, he was happy he did, but he went through a period of time where he felt like he was going through trials. And but he found relief in concentrating on hope and faith. And he saw what he was doing as creating a concrete approach to the metaphysical mystery of being. And so he saw thought itself as a turning towards the other. So that's another thing that affirms being and affirms communion. And thought requires being. And he had to acknowledge that suicide, despair, and betrayal are always real possibilities, but also that they can be transcended through fidelity, hope, and faith. And he saw that our world requires, many times our world requires that we shut off the mystery and live in a world of problems and objects. So he saw problems as just things that that lend themselves to a solution, whereas mysteries are just something to be experienced. And like he even saw the love between men and women as something of a mystery. So to attain being, he suggested that we have to break through that shell of seeing things as problems and objects. And then in doing that, we can transcend our condition. And he saw it as our life as an engaging in a quest for participation in our own personal reality. He also saw it as some choices here. We could either affirm or deny our being. We could either after negation or affirmation. Negation in despair or suicide, and affirmation in just seeing life as a mystery, and seeing life as engaging in a community, engaging in communicating with the other. He even saw memories as part of the mystery. His memories suggested to him that there's something in me that is not identical with my life. He saw when we're remembering things and recollecting that there's a part of us that's looking at another part. And I just want to read a short quote here. The ontological order can be recognized personally only by the whole of a being engaged in a drama which is his own, while yet surpassing him infinitely in every sense. A being to whom has been imparted the singular power of affirming or denying himself, inasmuch as he affirms being and opens himself up to it, or as he denies it and thereby closes himself. For it is in this dilemma that there lies the very essence of freedom. So he saw it as two possibilities, and he also saw it as two worlds. There's a world of problems and techniques, or the world of mystery and presence, of unity and community. And one of the plays he wrote about is called The Broken World. He saw this world of problems and objectivity as a world with no unity or community. Well, early Marcel was writing about existence versus being. And in this time period we're covering now, this is middle Marcel. He is involved now, or he's writing now, about being versus having. And for them, this came down to fulfillment versus frustration. And the basic question of being is, what am I? And for Marcel, this was not something that anyone can be objective about. This is only something that can be experienced. And Marcel doesn't see a distinction between the spiritual and the physical. And he acknowledges that some would say that I am myself, but I have a body, and Marcel rejects that. He said, if to exist means to have a body, so the two are inexorably combined. They can't be separated. They're distinct but intertwined. So this idea is of being. This is the global feeling that I am, that I exist, and having is just and the other feelings that we have that aren't global. They're just transitory, and they're having is just wanting things, wanting to possess things, and it's being obsessed with others as objects instead of the thou. And this having things and wanting things, this causes tensions and then a fear of loss, and there's that attempt to incorporate possessions into the self, and then there's the pain of coveting things that one doesn't have. And this having doesn't just apply to physical things; it also applies to academic scholarships and techniques and skills and specialization, and even the communication industry and the political apparatus and the economic apparatus. And Marcel suggests that we can counterbalance that having, that experience of having, with pursuing art and religion and metaphysics. And in being, one can be available, engaging, or unavailable and holding back. And when one is unavailable and concerned with having, then one is preoccupied with himself and possessions. We get preoccupied with our life, our talents, our qualities, our status. We become consumed by existence, and we worry about time. There's this boundless anxiety that ends in hopelessness and dread. But for Marcel, he reminds us that the feeling of even wanting to possess others, that can be transformed into a desire to be with someone. Instead of wanting to possess them, we can want to be with them as a person where they respect and having their own being. And that dread that comes from having can lead to hope, and hope to availability, and from a mistrust that reality itself is against us, can lead to the idea that there's something in reality that wills what I want when I want something good. And for Marcel, all hope was a hope of salvation or salvation. All hope is a hope of salvation or resurrection. So, for Marcel, he says that we are living in a broken world, but even this broken world is a world where hope exists and where miracles are possible. This is what Marcel says. Metaphysically speaking, the sole authentic hope is that which rests on what does not depend on us. Hope seems to me like the prolongation into the unknown of a central activity, that is, one rooted in being. Hence, its affinities not indeed with desire, but with will. The will, too, in fact, involves a refusal to calculate possibilities, or at least a halt in such calculation. Thus, could not hope be defined as a will bearing on what does not depend on it? So on the other hand, there's self-centeredness and desire, and on the other hand, there's openness to being. And what is at stake is the soul. And we can choose to live life, or we can choose to deny our being. And with this being, there's the idea of communion and participation in being, opening up and being available and engaging. And this engaging, this is what, and wanting to participate, this is what Marcel refers to as fidelity. It's a promise once and for all, and it doesn't depend on momentary feelings or your current disposition. It's something you commit your future self. And this engagement acknowledges the existence and the reality of other beings. And Marcel compares this to a promise to visit a sick man. If we know someone who isn't well and we promise to come visit them at a future date, we keep that promise, even though we might not feel like it when the time comes. And this is that feeling of fidelity. For Marcel, that's a creative action. And he said that availability is expressed in hope, and engagement is expressed in fidelity. All right, now I want to talk about person and community in Gabriel Marcel's thought. And this all ties into the idea of how availability and engagement lead to participation in being, and then how being unavailable leads to frustration. And to relate this to God, Marcel believed that relation to God is understood through a discernment of the basic acts of human existence. And he saw this as we're in a series of trials and situations. And we start from a concrete human experience. And to concentrate on the objective and the verifiable is to miss out on transcendence. And religious experience requires that we understand things like trust and loyalty and sacrifice and promise and witness. Marcel was thinking about the basics of human existence during the rise of Hitler. Marcel saw firsthand the Nazi subjugation of France. In 1940, he wrote the book From Refusal to Invocation, and he wrote about an imminent struggle against the denial of man by man in that writing. And then in 1944, he wrote Homo Viator, and the themes in that are exile and captivity and alienation and separation and hope and fidelity. And his audience at that time was under German occupation. But Marcel wasn't just doing this, he wasn't covering those themes just during that time period. He also talked about these same topics in his metaphysical journey, journal written in the teens. And even though Marcel he engaged with other existentialist thinkers and he knew the French existentialist thought, he rejected things like the idea that we're condemned to be free and the idea that we're thrown into existence. And Marcel thought that his thought is an expression of existential experience and is not an attempt to make a system of experience. But there are some main themes, and some of these main themes are these here. The first one is, I am my body. This recurs over and over in Marcel's thinking, that we exist as our bodies and our experiences and our feelings. They can't be separated. Our body can't be separated from who we are. And then I exist in a situation, but this situation isn't just a location, it's also values and involvement and vulnerability. And another topic is human existence is personal and requires a community. This is where those I-thou relationships come in. And tied up in this idea of community is we're not just a community of others, we actually commune with ourselves. It's not egoism, it's not being obsessed with our position and our talents, but it's more like a charity towards ourselves as the potential that we have. And there's this creative patience and lucidity, and there's a striving for the highest self-realization. And when we see ourselves as we really are, and yet we remain intimate with ourselves. We can be honest about our faults. And then when we love ourselves the way that Marcel envisions, it's not just myself that I love, but all of mankind. And tied up with this, there's a patience with with the self. There's an open attitude of temporality. We accept the temporary setbacks, and there's a patience toward the possibility of change. There's this idea that we can take our time. And the last theme is transcendence, the idea that there's something beyond this reality. And the reason we can know this is because we have values and because we have hope. And Marcel saw man as a wayfarer, traveling from existential brokenness to ontological fullness. And I just want to close with a quote. Perhaps a stable earthly order can be established only if man retains an acute consciousness of what we may call his itinerant condition. That is, if he recalls perpetually that he has to beat a risky path across the uncertain blocks of a broken world, which seems to be disappearing on all sides, toward a world more strongly established in being, and of which it is given to him to perceive here below only the changing and uncertain reflections. Does not everything occur as if that broken world turns implacably against who claims to settle down there to the extent of building there a permanent dwelling? It is certainly not to be contested that the affirmation of that beyond carries a risk, the noble risk of which the ancient philosopher spoke. But the whole question is to know whether in refusing to run the risk one is not engaged in a road which, sooner or later, leads to perdition. Religious experience is another thing that Marcel talked about from the very beginning. And for him, that is the relation between man and ultimate reality. And God was included in this ultimate reality. So for early Marcel, there's speculation about participation and the thou relation and trial. And then in his later works, he mentioned some concrete portrayals of fidelity, hope, and belonging in that familial bond. And also in his later works, this religious experience is the experience of living in contradiction and tension and ambiguity. And for Marcel, human existence is about communion between I and thou. He thought that we all experience our own body and enter into a creative availability that allows us to encounter other beings and God. So for Marcel, the religious experience isn't just a private encounter with God. It always involves being with other people. And even solitary prayer is a communal activity. And for Marcel, the virtues of faith, hope, charity, and the things like prayer and sacrifice and the burden of sin and the struggles for salvation, all those are because there's an availability with this ultimate primal being, and that includes the being of God. And Marcel thought that religious faith can be understood by just watching people, because they're faithful to other people and they trust other people. And we may not understand what it means to believe in God, but we can know what it means to trust a friend or to be faithful to our wife. And Marcel believes that common acts of hope and trust and loyalty show kind of an odd disregard for the empirical conditions we find ourselves in. And he thinks of them as creative acts. And they speak of a bond and a desire for communion. And if we're frustrated in that communion, then we either seek out that union and that communion, or we do some self-negating. And he just admits there's always that choice. So for Marcel, here's some of the main topics: hope, fidelity, sacrifice, and prayer. And hope is there even through the realities of death and suffering and frustrations. Our souls are always remaining available to hope, or open to hope, and they're available. It's that availability that Marcel talks of over and over again. And then with fidelity, that's about remaining true. And he thinks it's interesting that we have that feeling of remaining true even after someone has died. That feeling of fidelity is unaltered by death. And then he speaks of sacrifice and prayer. And these require that availability again, and the communion between an I and a thou, and the thou with a capital T, referring to God. So for Marcel, there are two modes of reality. And in his early work, he talked of existence versus objectivity. And then he also mentioned mystery versus problem. And finally, he mentioned being versus having. So with existence versus objectivity, existence is sensible. We participate in feeling versus being a mannequin who just is concerned with objective thought. And for Marcel, this feeling is, first of all, that feeling of self-presence, of me feeling my own body, of a person feeling his own body. We're aware of our own body. And then there's that active opening to and entering into an experience of reality. And he talks of a creative receptivity. And that receptivity is a participation and an availability, a being with. Then the other way he saw these two realities are mystery versus problem. So there is an involvement and availability in the mystery versus detachment. So being is a mystery in which I'm personally involved versus a problem is something that's outside of me that has to be solved. And then the third way is being versus having. And being is that global feeling of my own existence. And it's my body versus the mere things I want to possess. So for Marcel, it was that these two ways of being are intertwined. They're mutually involved and they're intertwined. And Marcel obviously pushes the more primal parts of that, the existence, the mystery, and the being. So religious worship for Marcel is that being with again. It's a starting point for any philosophy of transcendence. That the transcendence being the idea that there's something beyond this reality that we experience. And for Marcel said there was a close analogy between worship and metaphysical vision, and that they both start in wonder. So to exist is to be influenceable by others and directed towards otherness. And being is being en route towards a transcendent reality and toward God and the absolute thou. So I exist means I feel and I believe. I feel like that indicates that we're open to others, and I believe. We believe in others. And it's always a choice. We can cut ourselves off from God and others. And death for Marcel is unusual in that he sees it as evidence that there is something beyond. Because the way that we treat faith and the way that we treat fidelity, it just points to something that exists beyond death. And Marcel thought that man's situation in the world is such that he must either affirm or deny his being and his relations to the ultimate being. He thought that trials and existence itself are religious in nature. And they're what bind us to ultimate reality. And they're what bind us to nature and to other beings and even to ourselves. So for Marcel, all religious acts are expressions of being. And they express a union with ultimate reality. And in religious acts, it is my being that is at stake, not my having. Well, now we're going to talk about the phenomenological way. So Marcel recognized that in phenomenology there are basic realities that are not logically demonstrable nor objectively describable. And phenomenology is exploring these realities. It's seeing consciousness from a first-hand perspective. And early in his metaphysical journal, it seemed to him that religious experiences like trials and prayer, they could only be understood by the person experiencing the phenomenon. He thought these things were so personal that there's no way that other people could understand what was going on. But then, as time went by, he came to the conclusion that there are ways to understand. If we we understand that someone is going through the trial and we see them as one of us, if we have sympathy for them, then we are partaking in the same type of experiences. And then later on, he also said that outsiders could understand what's going on through concrete metaphors and images. And this phenomenological method that he had was shared by other writers like Scheller and Heidegger and Sartre, and also the founder is generally considered to be Husserl. And Marcel uses some of Husserl's same terms like intentionality, and he talks about philosophers being the eternal beginners, and he uses a similar meditative method, and he calls for return to beginnings. But Marcel had his own methods worked out long before he was exposed to Husserl. So this is his method is very unique to him, to Marcel. And Marcel, as opposed to Heidegger, he prefers an ordinary language, and he uses everyday examples, or everyday situations as examples. And he has more of an easygoing approach. If you want to understand more of what Marcel thinks about this, then a good place to start is the Gifford Lectures in the book The Mystery of Being. And there Marcel writes of there being an intermediary type of thinking between subjective and objective. It's not just either or. He thought that our feelings themselves have an objective reality. If we know anything, we know what we're feeling, what we're experiencing. And they refer to what is really there. But only the understanding mind can make sense of these feelings. So it's not just subjectivity, but it's rather, it's being open to what is really there. This is the idea of transcendence again. And Marcel compared it to like the feeling that we have when we're reading novels. We know that there's something going on, something that the author is trying to tell us, something behind the scenes. In the same way, when we're watching plays, we know that the playwright is trying to make some points. And Marcel thought this, that we can understand presence. This is another term he used. So we can understand presence when we sense that desire we have to protect a guest or a child or someone who's been wounded or a sleeping person. And we can look at other acts and situations and come to understand their essence and their inner meaning. So another example is exploring the phenomenology of tolerance. And he suggested that it's not just a feeling or an attitude, but he described it as somewhere between an attitude and a transcendent spiritual dynamism. He thought that tolerance is attending to other as the other. It's not reducing him in some way to an object. It says, I insist on granting freedom and respect to the other, this other who differs with me. And I want to see him as being like me, but just having a different position than I do. And Marcel thought this same tolerance was applicable to the ecumenical problem. And he thought that true believers must also take the other as he is. Even if we think the other has heretical beliefs, we should be able to just take him as he is without having a holier-than-thou attitude or having this feeling, Marcel calls it an idolatry of a tyrant God, have this feeling that there's this God who wants what we want, and instead having an open love of the other as he is. And Marcel thought that this applied to the Catholic Church also, that being ecumenical was required of the Catholic Church, that there should be a spirit of humility and charity, and that conversion to Catholicism doesn't come through a spirit of us versus them, the good and the wise against the bad and the stupid. But he thought the Catholics had to show out or live out their faith and embody the truth that they believe, and that they could be working, that they could and should work with others in the work of justice and charity. And when it came to believing in God, Marcel thought it was a mistake just to reject the non-believer as being willful about his disbelief. And instead thought we should try to see, believers should try to see the unbelievers as they saw as they saw the idea of God, or why. Why did they believe in God? And Marcel thought that believers ought to acknowledge that some people have not experienced a supreme being. And the very fact that we are living in this broken world, should be no surprise that some people have a hard time believing that there's a God. But he thought that being aware that we're living in a broken world could be enough for the unbeliever to look for something better. And then for Marcel, so these religious experiences, they come real when we actually participate in them. It's not enough to talk about them. Like the mystery of love and faith, they become known through participation. And so getting back to just doing phenomenology in itself in a general way, Marcel thought that this studying the consciousness is something that requires that we become like a child again. And it's not something that's going to make one popular in academic circles. And he recognized that every man judges for himself the truth of his findings. And it's as if we're an artist creating a work of art, and only the artist knows what needs to be done, where the paint needs to go. If he's creating a beautiful painting, only the artist knows. And he also recognized that there's universality to this approach. So we could recognize that we're all wayfarers. People who are doing phenomenological study are all wayfarers. And he said that if you're doing this, then you're going to find others on the same journey.